Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Buddy Shah. Buddy is the managing director at GiveWell, an organization that does a lot of things, but is primarily known for evaluating the effectiveness of charities around the world. And today we're going to be talking about GiveWell's work, about the philosophy of charity, really, and how we should think about how we give, how we should, when we give to charity, how should we be doing it? Is there a way that's better than other ways? And some of just, the issues that come up there. So, Buddy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeremiah. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. We've had a lot of effective altruism kind of people in that sphere. I don't know what to call it, in that bubble, in that sphere, in that community. Community might be a good word. But we've had Rob Wiblin, who is a big promoter of GiveWell, I think, over at 80,000 hours. We've had Rob Mather, who is the CEO of Against Malaria, who I know you're all very familiar with. And it's great to actually have the folks at GiveWell finally on the show.
Yeah, well, if folks have listened to both of those previous podcasts, then I think they'll have a nice introduction to the work that we do.
I hope so. But before we get into GiveWell specifically, I'm interested in hearing kind of how you personally got into this space, because, you have this really high educational background. You graduated from Harvard, and I think you've also got like a master's in public policy or something like that from Harvard, right?
Yep.
And then you found your way towards working in charity or in the kind of nonprofit field in India, which is not what I would imagine the typical double Harvard grad does. So can you tell me what your journey was like, just getting into the charity space or into the nonprofit space? What motivated you there, and why are you doing this, basically?
Yeah, no, great question, and nice to start with the fundamentals. I grew up in a small city in Pennsylvania, near Scranton, Pennsylvania, but my parents were immigrants from East Africa and India, so kind of Gujarati origin, but had lived in East Africa for several generations. And so, growing up in a very typical suburban, small town American lifestyle, but going back to see family from East Africa and India essentially every summer. And so those trips were like any trip that a kid would take to visit their cousins. And so, except that they happened to be to parts of the world that, especially then, were extremely poor and largely closed economies. And I didn't make much of it at the time, but, in retrospect, I do remember bringing things like Bic mechanical pencils and Wrigley's chewing gum to my cousins because, you couldn't get a lot of those things in these much lower income and closed economies at the time. And my family were all, middle class, relatively fine in those countries. And so, that was my upbringing. And then I remember in college as a freshman reading John Rawls' The Theory of Justice. And, there's obviously a lot of really interesting ideas in that book, but the one that really struck me the first time I read it, and I still remember where I was sitting when I read it, and thinking about this whole idea of the accident of birth and the extent to which our kind of standing in society is driven by a bunch of things that are essentially morally arbitrary, that we didn't deserve them in any real sense. And so obviously I had taken a lot of pride as a young 17-year-old in college, having gotten into the school I wanted to go to, that, I was smart, I was hardworking, that I kind of quote unquote deserved a lot of this. And then reading this idea that, well, where you're born, the kind of upbringing you have, even how smart you are, or how hardworking you are so, if not fully determined, at least largely influenced by things like your genetics or your upbringing, which you didn't deserve in any real moral sense. And I think reading that part of Rawls's writing just caused me to really think back about my cousins in East Africa or in India or in Oman, who, clearly were as intelligent as me, as hardworking. Their parents invested as much in them to their abilities, but especially at that time, had very different kind of set of opportunities and outlook about what they can do. And, that really hit me quite hard. And essentially from that point on, felt that my core obligation was to try to create a world in which people like my cousins, essentially anyone who was not a victim to the accident of birth, but had the kind of full range of opportunities in order to pursue the life that they had reason to value, whatever that kind of a life was. And so that took me down this long trajectory. And initially I thought, I'll be a physician, and maybe an academic physician that did research on certain topics. And so I did, in fact, go to medical school, and found the process pretty unsatisfying. And I think the core reason was that, especially if you're focused on patient care in highly underserved areas, two of the things that you pretty quickly realize are a lot of the more significant drivers of ill health and death are actually a function of kind of public health measures. And so by the time someone actually comes to a physician or a nurse or a healthcare provider, you're almost getting them way too late, if what you really care about is doing a lot of good. And then secondly, even if you're able to heal someone or make them feel better, they're often going back to conditions in which they lack the kind of economic or other means to truly live a life that will be fulfilling for them. And so, I think that combined with just the natural kind of personal disposition of caring much more about structural issues and being more excited about that led me to economic development, and international development and global health more broadly. And so that's when I, kind of did this master's in international development at Harvard, and worked at the World Bank and MIT's Poverty Action Lab, and then really pushed in the direction of how do we make sure that the underlying policies, whether it's economic policies, public health policies, social protection policies, are much more robust versus kind of individual care.
Yeah, not to send us down a rabbit hole or anything, but I think people, when they look at, like, for instance, the increase in human lifespan that we've seen, since 1800 or whenever, and that's like one of the great accomplishments of human history, is how long we all live and how healthy we all are now comparative to the past. I think people actually overestimate, like, the effect of modern medicine in that, like, oh, it's because we have, like, really smart doctors now and they know a lot of facts about disease, where, certainly that matters, but really just public health, in terms of, like, we don't have, human waste laying around in the streets anymore, is probably most of it. And, just systems of sanitation and just our general level of wealth, I think, covers a lot of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Things like sanitation, improved sanitation, immunizations, antibiotics, some of the fundamental pieces of public health have driven a huge portion of the gains in life expectancy over the last couple hundred years.
It's also funny, the point you make about kind of the philosophy of Rawls. I use that kind of exact same argument about the accident of birth when I talk about immigration, because immigration is one of our great hobby horses on this podcast. And in our kind of group, our movement, we're very, very pro-immigration. And we use the exact same kind of, like, nobody gets to decide where they're born. There are a ton, we're wasting so much of the world's potential because we know that they could be producing at Western levels if they had, if they were here, or if they had the right infrastructure or whatever. So, but not to, not to go down that. We've done 100 podcasts on immigration. I don't want to, that's not what we're doing here today. Today, we're here to talk about GiveWell, and it's interesting to hear how you kind of got into the nonprofit space. But what you're doing right now is working with GiveWell. And can you give us the elevator pitch? For someone who's not familiar with GiveWell, who doesn't know all that much about what you do, why is GiveWell important? What do you do? Why does it matter?
Yeah, great question. So, at the really high level view is that GiveWell's core mission is to do as much good as possible. Period. That's obviously...
That's a tall order.
Exactly. That's a very hard question. And I think that, like, that core mission is best stated as a question, because you should never expect to be able to get a perfect answer to it. But our goal is to do as much good as possible. And practically how that manifests is that we're trying to identify the things that you can direct money to that will save the most lives per dollar spent, or improve the lives the most per dollar spent. Things like, improving someone's income the most per dollar spent. And so there's this very kind of hard approach of applying reason, rationality, and evidence to trying to identify the things that you can give money to that will save or improve lives the most per dollar. And once you adopt that kind of mindset that A, all human lives have equal value regardless of which country they're born into, and B, you really want to improve as many of those lives as much as possible per dollar spent, where we have ended up finding the best opportunities tend to be in things in either kind of preventable public health issues in the lowest income country parts of the world, or interventions that improve income in the lowest income parts of the world. And the reason for that is that if you're starting at a very low level of income, the kind of classic World Bank figure of under $1 a day or under $2 a day, then we believe that, any increase in your well-being proportionally is going to feel more than if you're already starting at $30,000 a year. And then secondly, a lot of the programs that have a lot of evidence that they're effective and are cheap, so that they're cost effective, and are underfunded or neglected, tend to be these relatively straightforward evidence-backed programs in public health. So things like anti-malarial bed nets to prevent kids from getting malaria, giving conditional cash transfers, essentially paying families to incentivize them to get their kids immunized. Those are all things that have a really robust scientific basis of evidence that if you're actually able to do them, then they're going to prevent illness and save lives with a high degree of certainty. They're also really cheap. These are basic technologies that have existed for a long time. And then third, and importantly, they're underfunded by national governments, by multilaterals, by other philanthropies. And so that's where there's a real opportunity for the money we direct to truly do a lot of good in a way that otherwise would not have happened if it weren't for us. And so that's a kind of overall GiveWell orientation of trying to identify and direct money to the programs that do the most good possible.
So this is a question that, maybe it should be better directed to Holden Karnofsky and Eli Hassenfield, because they're the founders of GiveWell. They go all the way back, but I'm going to ask it to you because you're here. And the question is basically I mean this in a good way, I promise, but does it kind of straddle the line between confidence and arrogance in a sense to say we're walking into this nonprofit field. This whole sector is crap. You're all crap. We know better than you. You all should shut up and listen to us because we know where the money should go. Is there kind of we're trying to do the most good we can, but we're almost, it's kind of an audacious thing to say, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that...
and I mean, you could argue, I promise this isn't an attack. It's kind of like,
sure.
Somebody walking into, a bunch of car companies and saying, I actually know how to make cars better than you. And then 10 years later, Teslas exist or whatever. There's a certain degree of arrogance required to do something like that, right?
Yeah. And, I think the way I'd reframe it is that we are really intense about asking the question, how to do as much good as possible. And if you're really intense about asking that question and trying to find the quote unquote truth about it, I do think it requires a huge amount of humility and openness to listening to a bunch of different arguments and then coming to your own conclusion based on kind of the reasoning and the data. And so while I certainly agree that the mere fact of asking the question, that the thing we care about most is doing the most good possible, not, are we doing some good, can come across as and read as arrogant. But I hope that in practice, and I think this is something that GiveWell has gotten better at over the years, that our rhetoric reflects what we aspire to in terms of humility and really trying to understand other strategies, other points of view, and incorporating that in order to update how we do what we do. And so, I guess the distinction I really want to draw is between having this relentless pursuit of asking the big question, how do we do as much good as possible, versus speaking and acting in a way that we believe we already kind of have the answer to that. It's more that we're in constant pursuit of the answer to that question. We recognize we're not there, but we're going to keep asking it and hopefully keep getting better. And a core part of continuing to get better at answering this question of how to do the most good possible is listening in a very open way to people, especially people that kind of disagree with our approach on more fundamental levels.
Fair enough. And certainly the community you're in is never shy about letting people know when they disagree with them. So it's not, I don't think GiveWell has ever been shielded from criticism in that way.
And Jeremiah, just one really practical way that manifests is in this kind of core value of transparency that GiveWell has. If you think about the philanthropic landscape, one of the issues is that there's often very little visibility into what grants are made, the reasoning behind those grants, and what outcomes someone directing money hopes to achieve. And one of the core values of GiveWell is that we publish all of our research transparently to the public. We kind of state very clearly what impact we think particular program can have, what our assumptions are, and our entire cost effectiveness model is kind of on live in public. And I hope that that's at least one mechanism by which we're able to hear the criticism of others is, by being fully transparent with our own reasoning and our own decision making.
So one of the things that you're really well known for is doing really, really deep level analysis on many different kinds of charities. So can you walk us through how does GiveWell actually go about an analysis? Like when you say you're starting from scratch with some sort of charity that's going to be doing some sort of developmental work in Africa of some kind, what are you looking at to begin with? What do you want to see? What kind of factors do you consider? What kind of complications are always make sure to note these complications in the model? Can you kind of walk me through an example of how that would be done?
Yeah, absolutely. So, often our starting place is in the published scientific literature. So what we want to do is see programs that have been studied rigorously in the field and could plausibly meet our bar of cost effectively saving or improving lives. And that often starts with something called a randomized controlled trial. So when you're thinking about, is this program actually going to do good? Let's take the case of anti-malarial bed nets, since listeners, might be familiar with the work of AMF. Anti-malarial bed nets that are treated with insecticides are meant to, go over a kid's bed, or adult or child, protect them from from mosquitoes that carry malaria at night. And if you properly hang them up over your bed, then it substantially decreases the chances that you'll get bit by a mosquito and therefore contract malaria, which then substantially decreases the probability that you'll die. Now, there's a whole bunch of practical questions that one would ask is, does the net that has the insecticide really prevent the mosquitoes from entering? Can users, in low-income parts of the world, which, and they might not have access to all the kind of like best construction materials, actually pin up the net in such a way that it creates a full covering of the bed? Are they going to use those nets for alternative things like fishing? Will the more quote-unquote important members of the family who are also less susceptible to death end up disproportionately using the net, so the adults get it rather than the kids, or men get it disproportionately compared to women? And so there's all these big questions about, okay, this plausibly could work, but does it actually save and improve lives in practice? And the way that we answer that is to run kind of essentially clinical trials. So you take thousands of villages and you randomly select half of them to get kind of extra bed nets, and then the other half kind of continue as they were, whether that's whatever programs the government's funding or other NGOs, and then you observe over some course of time what's the difference in outcomes in terms of cases of malaria and deaths between the villages that got the bed nets and the communities that didn't. And because you have kind of thousands of villages and you've randomly selected which ones get the nets and which ones don't, then you have a real scientific understanding of the true effectiveness of the net, because everything else all the other factors that could affect mortality should be balanced between the treatment areas and the control areas. And so that's often considered the quote unquote gold standard to figure out what is the true effectiveness of bed nets or any other medication or international development program. Now, that is simply the starting point for us. And if there's a study that shows that, okay, antimalarial bed nets do seem to be effective, then we start this very intensive research process of trying to ask, what is the true cost effectiveness? How many lives could be saved per dollar spent by investing in this? And the types of things that we look at are, first, how robust was that study? Was the sample size large enough? Were there any other confounding factors that should lead us to be more skeptical of that study? So that's what we kind of call internal validity adjustments that will actually adjust the strength of our belief in particular studies, and it's often multiple studies, and that will increase our confidence in that core thing of do bed nets decrease malaria and decrease deaths. Then the second kind of adjustment we say is, okay, fine, that study might have taken place in Kenya, but Kenya's pretty much got a lot of things figured out on malaria, and where the big funding gaps remain are in Nigeria or the DRC. And so how well does something that worked in Kenya actually generalize to the places that need it most, like Northwest Nigeria or the Democratic Republic of Congo? And then we'll quantitatively try to model what effect would we expect this same program to have if moved to another context? How does the underlying mortality rates differ? How do the other comorbidities differ? And actually state our assumptions explicitly, quantitatively model it. Then there's like a third set of things.
That's really interesting. I want to break in real quickly because this is a question I had been planning to ask later on, which is basically how do you account for external validity? You know, and one of the things that I look at when I look at published research, I've been doing this in a couple areas. I'm currently looking at things like, does pre-K work in the United States? What's the effectiveness of pre-K? What's the effectiveness of various income schemes, you know, like child tax credit and whatever? And one of the things that you find in studies, there's this generalized phenomenon, I'll say in research generally, that effect sizes tend to go down over time. And there's a lot of theories about why, but you can look at this in like psychological research, like how well does the one child, two marshmallow thing if they wait 15 minutes? Things like that, even just very basic things like that have replicated many times. The effect size has gone down over time. And you see this a lot framed in terms of external validity, that maybe for these kids when they did the initial study, it was like a superstar effect, a huge effect. But if you generalize it to all children of all ages and incomes and everything, it doesn't actually, work as well. And, maybe preschool, this one program that they're running in this one city is incredibly good for kids. But if you tried to actually nationalize it, it wouldn't work because, it's just scaling things up is hard. So that was a question I had, like, how do you move from RCTs, which are admittedly like a very good way to look at things, to, okay, we're going to give $50 million to these people this year and just trust that it works everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's an extremely critical question, especially because, the thing that we're most concerned about is what is the true effect of the marginal dollar that we direct to a program. And so getting this part of the process right is really important. And, obviously you're never going to have 100% confidence, but I'd say a couple of things. One is that, if you go online and look at GiveWell's cost effectiveness model, we try all those assumptions that you just stated, we try in our model to state those explicitly and say what we think the value is for each. So, in the case of bed nets, there's a whole bunch of things that could affect how well it generalizes to a new place. A is the quality of program implementation. Maybe the quality of government delivery or NGO delivery in Kenya is much higher than it is in DRC. And so that's not something that you're going to necessarily get a quantitative answer to if you're thinking about what it's going to look like in DRC or Nigeria, at least up front. But by stating that we think that's a critical factor, having conversations, trying to look at some data like general program implementation quality, at least you can state explicitly how much of a discount or adjustment you think you should apply as you take it from context A to context B. Then there's the things where, you do have kind of better empirical data to model, like baseline disease prevalence, and you have some understanding of how baseline disease prevalence is going to affect the effectiveness of your bed net or other intervention. And so, there's kind of that whole set of things that you can model. I think you're asking maybe a more fundamental question, which is like, to what extent do you believe and have confidence in the underlying science? And I think there we take a kind of very Bayesian approach, which is it's fine that there's an RCT, but we're starting from like, what should our prior belief be about the effectiveness of anti-malarial bed nets? So it seems scientifically plausible that you have insecticides, that they'll kill the mosquitoes or prevent them from biting someone. You've got a randomized trial that shows it works. And then if there are multiple randomized control trials from multiple locations that show it works, then that increases our confidence that something real is actually going on. And so step by step, we try to gather more and more pieces of information that either lead us to increase our confidence in our prior beliefs or cause us to revisit them. And so we try not to take any one piece of data, evidence, or information as definitive, but piece together this broader picture and keep updating our beliefs based on new information. And then importantly, with our work, we're making grants and then observing what actually happens. And so we do often fund new randomized trials if we think that fresh evidence from the places in which we're operating is needed. We'll collect independent monitoring data or coverage data to say, okay, are the nets being delivered the way we think they are? And just like, what do the trend lines look like in terms of prevalence of a particular disease? And so I think, those are a lot of the ways that we try to really, kind of corroborate that the effects that we anticipate having are actually happening.
I love that we focused on bed nets so much just because our community has a particular love of bed nets. I'm not sure if anyone can really love a bed net, but with a lot of the charitable work that like our community is kind of crowdfunded is focused on against malaria. So there's a lot of community chatter about bed nets and killing all the skeeters and stuff like that. So we'll get a lot of hits for that. But I don't know. I think this is the point in the conversation when I kind of admit like, look, I am fully on board with GiveWell. I'm not a neutral party here. I'm going to try in a little bit to kind of play devil's advocate and ask some tough questions. But, I personally donate my money to Against Malaria and some of the deworming charities, basically based on GiveWell's analysis and, encourage other people to do the same. And I'm basically on board. But I am going to try to poke around the edges of what you guys do and see if we can't come up with some tough questions. Because, it feels like my responsibility, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that.
But first, let me just poke around the edges. There's a couple ideas that I have about the whole effective altruist movement that I'd love to just see, your take on. Are these good things that, hey, yeah, maybe we should look into? Or are these kind of things where, actually, Jeremiah, we've thought about this and you're dumb and, we're not going to do that? Because if that's the answer, that's totally fine. One of the things that when I think about effective altruism generally, and I'm curious if it would apply to GiveWell, I think that lobbying is an underrated form of effective altruism. And I'll give kind of an example to introduce this idea. I know that there's a organization called Animal Charity Evaluators for people who are not concerned with global health and whose morality kind of just leads them to care about animal welfare more than anything. They are almost like a GiveWell for animal charities. I know one of the key findings they've found is that a lot of the most effective stuff, a lot of the most effective charities that they found basically spend their money on public policy, on lobbying either corporations or governments to change policies at a very high level, and that they save or impact the lives of 100 times as many animals doing that as the places that are more like, let's directly work with animals. And so, I'm curious, do you think there are areas in public policy in either rich countries or poor countries where lobbying could be cost effective as a way to impact people's lives?
Yeah, I love that you asked that. And I share those sentiments as well. And I think that, especially with GiveWell and effective altruism, oftentimes the parts that are really focused on measurable evidence-backed, high certainty programs like bed nets that save lives get the attention. I think that that's, not a bad thing, because it is quite stark that, a lot of our programs historically, it's kind of $3,000 to counterfactually save a life of someone who tends to be a kid and then is going to live probably another 50, 60 years. And, that's just insane that for $3,000, you can buy an additional 50 or 60 life years. It's an incredible buy. And so I think it's with good reason that those kinds of things do get a lot of attention. But that having been said, if the core commitment is to try and do as much good as possible, I think it's very natural to ask the questions you are, which is, if we invest in lobbying and that lobbying changes some regulatory practice or unlocks more government funding for something that's really good, and that's just on a much, much larger scale, then perhaps the marginal effectiveness of just funding lobbying could be even better than these other direct delivery things. And so to give two discrete examples of that already happening within the effective altruist community, one within GiveWell and one within our sister organization, Open Philanthropy Project, so with GiveWell, we made a grant to the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention. And so, as people might be familiar, especially in South Asia, there are a number of suicides from ingesting pesticides. And it turns out that there's actually a few specific pesticides that are kind of disproportionately, quote unquote, successful in actually causing the death of someone. And there are other pesticides for the same uses, agricultural uses, that don't. And so you could pass regulation that bans the pesticides that actually kill the most people in suicides, and that could be potentially really cost effective. And so, there was some success in Sri Lanka that had happened, and based on that, GiveWell made, researched it, modeled out how cost effective it could be, and made a grant to the Center for Suicide Pesticide Prevention to help the government of Nepal ban these pesticides. And, I think that grant went very well. That organization did work with the bureaucrats in Nepal to pass these regulations. And we anticipate that that is going to save a lot of lives and kind of be on the order of cost effectiveness, potentially even higher than our direct delivery programs like vitamin A supplementation or anti-malarial bed nets, or things like that. And so that's kind of a specific instance of identifying a regulatory change that could be really impactful, and then paying for, either think tanks or quote unquote lobbying or advocacy in order to drive that regulatory change. And then there's the broader one, which is, Open Philanthropy Project just recently launched a global aid advocacy portfolio. And the core idea there is, can we spend philanthropic dollars in order to increase the total amount of global aid or make it more cost effective? And, if you think about aid flows as being in the hundreds of billions of dollars, then potentially you can use a smaller amount of money in order to convince folks in Congress or within FCDO in England, or other places, to increase the total amount and get closer to the kind of like globally agreed upon 0.7% of GDP for foreign aid targets that, certainly the US doesn't reach. And so I think that there is a growing appreciation for those kinds of tactics, like funding, advocacy, lobbying, et cetera, for policy and regulatory change. And the big challenge is the extent to which you can attribute any changes that happen to you, and being able to model ex ante whether it is going to be a good return on investment versus not. And I think, I'm optimistic that we're thinking hard about it, even and embracing the uncertainty in measurement. But I do think it makes sense to scrutinize it very closely and state your assumptions clearly of, to what extent, if we fund $10 million for this regulatory change, what's the probability that it's going to happen? What's the probability that it would have happened without us? And then how good does that return look compared to the things that we can measure more? And I think a lot of the things that we can measure more directly just actually look really cost effective, even compared to a lot of these things that seem like you're getting much more leverage. And so in my mind, it's all about stating your assumptions explicitly and then trying to compare with the opportunity cost.
One of the things I think about is particulate matter in this particular paradigm, where anybody who reads research about PM 2.5, it's pollution, particulate matter in the air, walks away like kind of stunned at like the effect sizes you see, and you just see them everywhere, just over and over and over. And like there's credible estimates that I've seen that like more than 1 million people a year die in China because of like every year because of like how polluted their air is, just because of that. Like it's kind of astounding. Like the size, you know, you're talking about 100,000 people in the United States, which has much cleaner air than China. And, you know, I think about something like, I have no idea how lobbying works with the communist government of China. But if you could have some policy that in 2 years would reduce PM 2.5 in China by 20%, the amount of lives that you would save by, you know, pulling that lever is like unfathomable almost. So, but, you know, I think this gets into the whole conversation of how do you model things that you can't really run an RCT on? I guess what you've talked about, you kind of just have to put down some estimates and justify why you think that's it, basically, and, you know, embrace that this is something you can't know for sure. Because, you know, the one thing I think you don't want to fall into is kind of the looking for your keys under the street lamp phenomenon, right? This is the only place that is illuminated with good RCTs, so it's the only place we're going to look.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, the particulate matter air pollution piece is another great example where, you know, again, our sister organization, Open Philanthropy, is launching a portfolio devoted to trying to address that issue in South Asia.
I had not heard about that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's very new. You know, I think the new hire is just coming on, so they're just building out the portfolio. So you know, I mean, I think directionally you're thinking about a lot of similar things that folks within the global health and well-being space in effective altruism at GiveWell and Open Philanthropy are thinking about. And then on, you know, looking for your keys in the street lamp phenomenon, you know, I guess I'm a little bit less concerned about that, in part because, you know, we are thinking about and taking action on these other things that are less measurable. And so with South Asian air quality, you know, there's starting with the observation that it seems as though a lot of people are dying and there's a lot of morbidity and economic loss from this huge issue of air pollution in South Asia. And then the next question is, how tractable is it? You know, can you spend money in order to address or decrease this? And if you think it is tractable, then, you know, in the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, how good does it look compared to the things that are more measurable? And I do think that it looks promising, which is why Open Phil is putting money against it. And the way that, you know, you model it is, I think, similar to what I've been talking about. And I know on a previous podcast, you've talked about Drake's equation on, you know, a question that's potentially way less tractable than, you know, what are the returns to investing in trying to decrease air pollution in South Asia or increase the total amount of global aid. But the basic process is the same, which is really breaking down into its component parts. What's the action that you're going to take? What do you think it's likely to going to lead to, and with what probability? And then, you know, you can kind of build out that model and say, well, if we invest in regulatory change in India, what's the likelihood the government's going to actually change its policies? If it changes that policy in this way, how much is that actually going to decrease particulate matter? And if you get that decrease in particulate matter, how much is that going to decrease different kinds of illnesses? And then, you know, you can do that math. And I think part of the modeling exercise is not to assume that the model's going to spit out the perfect answer, but it's a forcing function to say what you would have to believe in order for this to be good. And that allows open debate and discussion. And, you know, I think, and at least give you a sense of, okay, is this in the ballpark of being good enough compared to our other options that are more measurable? And should we proceed? And then I think the second piece, which I would emphasize, is that with some of these harder to model things, ideally you have some feedback loop. And so it's not just that you're modeling some crazy thing and never observe whether you're making progress on it, but you're saying, okay, we're going to make investments in increasing global aid advocacy, or banning pesticides that are disproportionately used in suicides, or trying to decrease South Asian air pollution. And you make grants, they're not going to be perfectly measurable, but you should be able to observe some progress on proxies in order to update your beliefs about, is this still a good area to invest in? Should we be investing more? Or does it seem like we're not making the kind of progress that we should, and therefore it makes sense to instead invest in the things that we know to be cost effective with more confidence?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how we think about it.
All right, so I want to get into the part where I kind of take the devil's advocate view, and I start lobbing some common criticisms of GiveWell and of this whole thing that we're doing here, this whole effort that we've been talking about. There's people who aren't necessarily thrilled with it, and I want to just throw some of those at you and see how you respond to them. I did the very scientific thing of Googling GiveWell criticism and just looking at what came up. This is deep research we've done, but mostly because I wanted to see, I'm in this camp, and I want to know, are there people from completely different philosophical points of view that have just this whole effective altruism thing is bunk and it's hogwash? And I found a delightful article called "The Elitist Philanthropy of So-Called Effective Altruism." So I'm going to give you a couple quotes from this. They're actually pretty great. The superficially enticing logic is in quotes, of effective altruism ultimately leads to a moralistic, hyper-rationalistic, top-down approach to philanthropy that can kill the very altruistic spirit it claims to foster. We believe a more accurate phrase for this concept is defective altruism, and we'll use that term for the remainder of the article. So I have some questions for you about defective altruism, which I gotta be honest, I thought that was pretty incredible. But I read this whole article. These people are not happy with you at all. They call out GiveWell specifically as being some sort of moral nightmare or whatever. But what I could get out of this, if I'm giving them a good faith reading, is that in some sense, being charitable is a condition of the human spirit. And, trying to turn this into a series of equations is actually going to destroy that spirit and could lower total donations, and lower the amount of money that people give if they just are giving to some spreadsheet rather than to a human cause where they really understand what's going on and, they see the impact in a local community. If it's just all about spreadsheets and doing some kind of min-max utilitarian nonsense, then you've really destroyed what charity is about. So how would you respond to someone making that argument?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeremiah. I mean, I think these are important questions.
You are a defective altruist. That's what we're going to say for the rest of the podcast.
Great. So, I think there's three immediate questions that come to mind with that critique. The first is what they're saying actually an accurate description of how humans currently act? That humans' altruistic actions are a function of like appealing to emotion and things like that, and that by layering on reason, evidence, and numbers to see how much good you're doing, it's gonna diminish how much people want to be altruistic. So one is just like, how true is that? The second is, regardless of how true that is currently, to what extent do we think we can change, quote unquote, human nature and how they think about altruistic actions? And then I think the third is just
by the way,
okay, yeah.
I just got to say, I love that your response to a criticism that mostly is about the condition of the human soul is to build another Drake's equation about the whole thing. It's very on brand. I'm into it though.
And then, I think the third is just like listening really deeply for the parts of that critique where we should be learning a lot. And so let me take each of those in turn. Is that actually how humans act, that they're just so turned off by numbers and things like that, that it's not going to cause them, it's going to cause them to give less if too much of the emphasis in philanthropy is on, well, what are you actually achieving? And, I don't know about the median human and their altruistic motivations. There's certainly a lot of growing research on this from Joshua Green and others on just, what drives altruistic behavior in humans. What I would say is that I think you can make the argument in reverse, which is that people can be skeptical of altruistic action because you're not sure of what it's actually going to produce. And there is like this whole kind of tradition of skepticism about altruism and, whether you're actually doing any good. And so one of the things I think we've observed is that by placing a real emphasis on asking the question, how much good is actually achieved, and stating that explicitly and trying to measure that it actually increases people's confidence and potentially increases their altruistic behavior. Now, that's been in our experience. The number of donors and the amount of money being moved through GiveWell has been growing tremendously over the last decade. And that's obviously, potentially just appealing to a tiny percent of the population. And so it could still be the case that the average human is turned off by the kind of quantitative approach, but we don't see strong kind of evidence of that so far. Yeah.
I will say just that on its sample size of one, but as someone who's run many charity drives for Against Malaria Foundation through our community, and I think at this point we've raised something like $500,000 for AMF,
Nice.
just with our people on Reddit and Twitter and whatever donating what they can. I am very, very skeptical that basically my point that I'm going to make is that I think there's margins on which this argument is true. I don't know that it's universally true, but I think there are margins where it is true, because I think that, we did this with Against Malaria, and it kind of allowed us to make specific arguments about, Against Malaria has this specific thing. They're doing this. We all get excited about bed nets. We all make jokes about mosquitoes for a week straight, because it just turns into kind of this fun tribal activity where we're all one-upping each other who can donate the most and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think it would have had the same impact if we were, say, donating to the GiveWell Maximum Impact Fund, which, you can make the kind of cold utilitarian argument. It's better to give to the Maximum Impact Fund than to give to AMF on some margin. But it wouldn't have had the human story behind it that we're able to kind of pitch to our followers about you're helping, these people on this specific problem. It's a more confusing thing to say you're helping someone who has been determined by the spreadsheet, and we don't know what the money's going to exactly, but somebody looked into it. It's great. I do think there's margins on which, that kind of thing can be true, that people get more excited about a thing that they can recognize more easily.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm really sympathetic to that. And that was kind of my third point of, well, what can we learn from, what's the real truth in this critique? And I do think it is, let's think very critically about how we can change behavior and tell stories in a way that is still truthful and authentic to not overselling. And I do think kind of emotional appeals combined with the true underlying statistics and data of what your philanthropic contribution is going to achieve in terms of improving someone's life is important. And certainly, the effective altruist community GiveWell can get much better at the kind of narrative storytelling in an authentic to us way, which always has to be grounded in being measured, being focusing on the data. But I think there is a lot we can still learn about in terms of how to drive more altruistic and philanthropic behavior through better storytelling and appealing to people's emotions and how they actually make decisions rather than simply kind of focusing exclusively on the rationality. And I don't think the two have to be at odds necessarily, and that's an area where we can improve. The one thing I would say, though, is, the part of that critique which I really fundamentally disagree with is taking as static what humans care about, right? I think that argument was, well, some people are going to care about the arts and some people are going to care about education in their communities and some people are going to care about, infectious diseases in the developing world, and they're all equally good. And we shouldn't be trying to figure out what's more good than others. People should just kind of go with their feelings on where they want to be altruistic and help them manifest that fully. And I think something that we see at GiveWell, even with our really hyper focus, is that, how much good you can do even within an area depends a lot on the specifics. So something like seasonal malaria chemo prevention, another anti-malarial, depending on the country in which you invest, you can save 2 times as many lives investing in Burkina Faso than in Chad. It's like $4,000 per life saved versus $9,000 per life saved. And if you care about humans equally, then that's a massive difference that you should care a lot about. And so first I'd say is, the difference between the best thing and the 5th best thing makes a huge material difference, and we should really care about that. But then the second and more fundamental piece is just, I think that we can continually expand humans' circle of moral concern. And I think a big part of the Effective Altruist Project is to say, let's keep expanding our sphere of moral concern from, the family and your relatives to your tribe, to your larger community, to your nation state, to other humans, to other sentient beings, to future generations. And I think that to treat as a fixed given that humans care about certain things, and therefore we should just start with whatever someone cares about and help them find things to give to in that area, is really at odds with what I've seen as a gradual broadening of humans' moral concern and how much further we actually have to go in the future and can go in a really real and practical sense. And so, I take the progress on how much money is going to developing country issues on health and economic growth, on trying to reduce some of the suffering from farm animal welfare and investing in future generations as the kind of like next step in getting humans to care about things further and further from themselves and to treat themselves as being, more and more kin with all these other humans, regardless of where they live or other sentient beings.
I want to come back to the future generations thing in a minute, but just to circle back to a few things you touched on there. It's funny, I did an Ask Me Anything on an Effective Altruist forum. And I'm not sure why they asked me, but I did it. And it mostly because I think I've donated a kidney. And I did that altruistically, and that was part of it. And obviously I've done fundraisers for AMF. So I was just kind of this interesting figure to them, I guess. But one of the things they asked me was like, you run a political project that's kind of grown very quickly. What advice do you have for us in terms of messaging? Because you talked about that kind of like, we need to figure out how to message things to people. And literally my advice for them was like, you need better memes. You need better internet jokes and humor. And like, that seems like I'm making like a joke because I'm too online, because I'm on Twitter all day, but it's not. To grow the movement, you need the movement to kind of have identity and kind of like a collective consciousness, the same way that like, I don't know, you can look at this in politics, Twitter, where like if you have a rose in your Twitter handle, that means you're a socialist, and everybody can identify with that, and they've got their own jokes and their own memes and their beloved in group and their hated out group, and it grows the movement. And it's kind of antithetical to the whole EA paradigm. I don't think it's natural for people who are in that, but that was my ultimate advice for them, was literally you need like more group identifiers and more like cultural connections with each other than this. But it's an interesting thought. The other thing I was going to tell you, when you talk about the whole idea of like, not all things should be considered equal. Not, somebody wants to give to, Harvard and somebody wants to give to malaria nets, and, oh, well, they're both fine. And you're kind of like, well, no, that's not necessarily the case, right? I had a conversation with some family members one time where I was trying to explain this whole concept of, why are you giving to Against Malaria? Well, they're really well known. They do a really good job. And, just imagine this example where, if you could give someone a medicine that would save them from malaria, or you could give them a puppet show, what would you give them? It clearly makes more sense to do the malaria net, right? And I got some uncomfortable silence when I told them that, because it turns out they had literally just donated to a children's arts program in Nicaragua that does puppet shows. So that actually happened to me. And then I kind of had to recover myself from there. This story doesn't really have a point, but I really want to tell it to somebody, because it's the strangest thing that's ever happened to me in one of these conversations, that there are actual children's puppet shows in the third world that are somehow getting funding. So you guys still have some work to do, I guess, is the message.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's it's an important example, just because, it does reflect how people make decisions. And I think one part of that is providing more information, which is like, these are how many puppet shows you can fund with this amount of money. And, these are the number of lives you could save with that same amount, and which one feels better to you. But I also think,
What,
You know,
and
just
see,
like,
that's the thing.
yeah.
I wasn't expecting when I had that conversation with them for them to literally say, it feels real good to fund the puppet show because I just did it 2 weeks ago. I don't know how
Yeah,
you recover from that one, but I guess you can't win every conversation.
yeah. And I think the other is just like, people do care about a broader set of things than just doing the most good possible. And I think that within the EA community, people are trying to understand that, and it'll be great to spend more time, resources, in like real research, more deeply understanding what drives people and how to nudge them in the direction of of caring about things that where they can do more good.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's a complex world.
One of the other thoughts that I had when I was doing this Ask Me Anything on the Effective Altruist Forum was that we need a kind of dumbed down GiveWell. And what I mean by that is that I think the whole movement, effective altruism as a whole, spends a lot of time trying to find like the perfect solution for a lot of different questions. And there's a lot of like debate about like what is the best public health thing we can do. Obviously, that's kind of what GiveWell does. There's a lot of interminable debates about like, should it actually be public health, or should we be spending all our money on, preventing, an AI monster from arising from AI research, or preventing nuclear war, or doing animal welfare, or, long-term growth stuff that, affects 100 generations in the future. And one of the things I think about is, should we spend less time talking about all that stuff and more time just trying to nudge people who are not going to ever donate to the very best thing, but could donate to something better than they're doing right now? Because like I look at like, you probably know the statistic better than I do, but of the charitable money in the United States, what, like 5% of it goes overseas or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know the specific number, but it's a very, very small percentage.
It's on that magnitude.
Yeah.
And like, I wonder, like, if I could just talk to, suburban soccer mom in wherever in Illinois, and, I'm never going to convince her to donate to some really obscure thing. But like, if I could just, if she cares about education, maybe I could convince her to donate to a school in India, rather than the school next door to her, or to donate 25% of her money overseas. And that, even if we can't get her donating to specifically the GiveWell Maximum Impact Fund, if we could just don't push her a little bit in the direction that would do a lot of good. If we could kind of do that over and over again across the country, if we could kind of shape a normal person's behavior rather than continuing to debate like what's the best effective altruist thing to do. I think I phrased this as like, you get a better culinary improvement from improving McDonald's by 10% than you do from opening like a 3 Michelin star restaurant, just because there's so many McDonald's and so many people eat it, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about with charity. So I don't know, is there a model that can do this? Is anybody thinking about this problem?
Yeah, it's it's a good. I think it's a really important train of thought, and I broadly agree with it. I do think that there needs to be a lot more effort put towards, the, you might want to call it just like effective giving movement versus effective altruist movement. And, effective giving is much less of a coherent philosophy or ecosystem of organizations, but nudging people to say, okay, you care about education. Well, you can increase literacy for a lot more kids by, donating that money or supporting programs in Bangladesh or India than you can next door. I think that is really helpful, both because of the direct impact in and of itself, but then also, I think it then starts getting people thinking more and more in terms of effectiveness and, do I really care about all humans the same regardless of where they live? And I think that starts them down this kind of path of self-exploration and scrutiny that gets them closer and closer to kind of where GiveWell is. And so I think it's valuable. I think there are some that are working on it. There's an organization called The Life You Can Save that is trying to do a little bit of this by having a kind of bigger funnel at the top. there's pledges like One for the World, which, recruits graduating college students to pledge to give 1% of their income every year. But I guess there's less dedicated effort towards something like that.
One of the things that frustrated me recently was my wife, for instance, has a really big spot in her heart for women's issues. And, this is money that's probably not replacing anything else. She wants to donate specifically to that. And it's not like she's doing that in place of something else. This is probably like she's donating to this or nothing else in some instances. And so I'm looking, okay, we could donate to domestic stuff, NARAL or Planned Parenthood or things like that. But what I wanted was to find some online resource that would tell me, if you care about women's issues, here's the best bang for your buck in terms of reproductive health in the third world, or, getting access for women to be able to XYZ in a lot of countries, because women's rights are not in a great place everywhere in the world. And I couldn't find a lot on that. And I think if there was more of that, it would be helpful for people who care about just assorted issues like that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the concept of GiveWell for X, where there are many X's, women's issues or education.
Or like animal charity evaluators, exactly. Which I think is great. I think they're fantastic.
Exactly. I think that's really, I do think that's really valuable, especially for those cases, as you said, where someone, at least for the time being, is really intent on devoting to a particular type of cause, and then they want to find the best thing within that cause. I think that needs to happen. I think for GiveWell, for us, that is something that in the past we've considered whether we should add different things. But I think that there's a large enough base of people that are putting money into GiveWell that buy into the core philosophy of trying to do as much good as possible in this broader sense, where we need to stay laser focused on continuing to find the best opportunities within that. But I do think if there are people that have the energy and passion to do it in new areas, that probably could be a really valuable complement, for sure.
The next couple criticisms or suggestions kind of come from inside the EA community. And these are things that people talk about, and it's coming back to the long run kind of question. How does GiveWell think about the long run? Do you have kind of like a discount rate? Do you have a defined way that you think about lives saved over time? Because there's a lot of different viewpoints here where, some people are very much maximalists on economic growth. There's kind of the Tyler Cowen style argument that in the long run, economic growth rate is all that matters, and all the other problems are going to get figured out over time as we get richer. And society should be aiming to maximize the rate of economic growth. And, maybe I'm being simplistic in his argument, but some people would say that. How does GiveWell think about the long run beyond just what can we do this year?
I'd say our orientation, because we have these sister organization in open philanthropy and peers in the effective altruist community thinking about the long run future. I think we've made the kind of strategic choice that for now we're focused on the quote unquote near term. So how do we improve human welfare as much as possible in the next, say, 50 to 100 years? So that's the kind of time horizon on which we think. And practically for all of our programs, we do explicitly model discount rates and, how we anticipate different benefits to compound over time. So we take that into account explicitly. But that's more mechanical of, if you are doing something that improves incomes, how do we expect that to impact someone over time? I think the question you're really asking is are we just trying to save kids' lives now, or if we could invest money that increases economic growth and really starts paying off 50 years down the line, how would we think about that? I think we're intellectually open to things that pay off over a much longer time horizon, funding economic growth or something else. We've already made grants where we anticipate the benefits to come further in the future than something that's like a direct delivery program. So some of the grants that we funded in public health regulation to drive change in pesticide regulation or lead or alcohol regulation are ones where we kind of explicitly have to deal with things like over what time period do we think a change is going to happen and how do we compare that to present things. So, all that's happening on the bigger question of should we just be investing in economic growth, that's something we're intellectually open to, but we're not prioritizing right now, in part because I think others are spending time on it, and also in part because, I think we see a lot of really great opportunities for programs to fund in the near term that pay off more on the type that we have, but it's something that's kind of on the longer list for us to look into.
Yeah, I think you run into two problems there, just because I don't necessarily think that's what GiveWell should do. Number one, because there's politics involved. If you really start getting involved in economic growth, you can't stay politically neutral the way that you pretty much are now. And, there's real danger if you start advocating for political you can't address economic growth forever without getting into actual politics, and what are tax rates going to be? What is regulation policy going to be? Things like that. So that there's danger if you become political that you split the movement or something like that. There's kind of what I'll call existential risk for GiveWell in the sense of if you try to get into politics. The other thing is that nobody really knows how to improve economic growth. You're gonna get libertarians telling you one thing and social democrats telling you another thing, and how do you actually know what improves economic growth in the long run? It's a very difficult question. Economists have not figured that out yet, surprisingly. So, but another thing people talk about within the EA movement is the value of kind of non-traditional ways of thinking about philanthropy. And I'll introduce this by noting that GiveWell is no longer really about that marginal $5,000. I know that some of your founders like to talk about we started because, we wanted to know we're giving $5,000, where should it go? What is the marginal $5,000? Where will it do the most good? But you're now operating on the scale of hundreds of millions of dollars. And so you're playing with such different amounts of money that your marginal thinking changes tremendously. And I know you guys have the ambition to get up to $1 billion a year relatively soon. And at that level, you can start to do things that traditional charities can't do. And one of the things I think about when I think about like what's had the most impact in positive terms for humanity recently, I certainly think the impact per dollar for malaria nets and deworming initiatives and things like that are fantastic. But if you ask me what the best things are, I'd say like mRNA research is one of the best. Whoever funded mRNA research probably had more impact on the world than anyone else, or whoever has been funding solar research, because solar power has been brought down by more than 99% in cost. And that can change the world, in terms of addressing climate change. And so I think there's this argument that should someone like GiveWell, with resources at the staggering scale that you guys have, be looking at, research and development opportunities that can change the world? Because, something on the scale of mRNA research, you could conceivably have a miss rate of 9 out of 10 things, but as long as you hit one thing like mRNA, the cost effectiveness could still be worth it.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the growth in our funding does raise these really important strategic questions of what we should focus on. And I think the types of things that you're alluding to, like investing in breakthrough technologies and R&D on the types of problems that we think are really important, is something that, is and should be on our radar. But I'd say a couple of things. First, I think the first is that you've got to ask the question around how...
admittedly, It's a lot easier for me to just say, hey, buddy, just go invent some world-changing technology. Why don't you? Like, are you lazy? Why haven't you done it yet?
It's
easy for me.
The reason I'm pausing is because it is a really important and kind of live question for us. I think one thing practically is that, there is this relationship between GiveWell and Open Philanthropy. Open Philanthropy Project does have this kind of like scientific research portfolio that's kind of well set up to think about these kinds of things and has funded things of the type you're talking about. So that's just like one practical thing to mention. I think the second is that we would just ask the question, how underfunded is the investment in some of these breakthrough technologies or R&D? And I think in the case of certain neglected tropical diseases, you could probably make a very strong argument that they are underfunded relative to how scientifically plausible it is to get a breakthrough. And I think in other parts of pharma,
is this
or
kind of the
it's not.
This is the argument that we spend more money researching like male enhancement pills than trying to like deworming medicine because there's more money.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly
right. And so, I think you could say that, yes, there is a lot of room for more R&D investment in the kinds of things that drive a lot of deaths in low-income countries, but don't have a big market for it. And then the third is just like, what is the organizational comparative advantage on where you should focus, right? So GiveWell is, I think, phenomenal at doing very deep research on programs that already exist and trying to determine what their true cost effectiveness is. GiveWell's also really good at some of these like harder modeling questions, what's the effect of investing in some sort of advocacy for a regulatory change and coming to a reasonable answer. And then for something like scientific advancement, I think that's a place where you'd have to think hard about what are the core competencies that we would need to add to our existing strengths. How does organizational kind of culture need to adapt in order to make this very different type of grant or resource allocation decision? And so I think the upshot of all of that is for the next couple of years, we continue to see opportunities to save and improve lives really cost effectively based on the kind of real core competencies that we have that other funders are just ignoring. And so there's a great case to keep doing that. And then in parallel, I think actively exploring the questions that you're asking and seeing, what additional competencies should we add, what additional areas of investigation and grant making should we add is very much a live question, even though it's not something that we're prioritizing like right now.
All right. So we're kind of coming up on time here. We've had you here for a while, and we definitely appreciate that. And I'm going to close by asking our traditional final question, which is, if people are interested in GiveWell's work or effective altruism more generally, or just any of the things that we're talking about, are there any particular resources you would recommend? This could be someone's blog, someone's Twitter to follow, a particular book, a particular research paper. What would you recommend for people who want to learn more?
Yeah, I think the first spot is the GiveWell website, in particular the GiveWell blog, which is quite interesting because it obviously talks about the actual programs that we direct funding to, but then unpacks in a lot of detail some of these other questions that we've been exploring today. So that's one. I think the second is Larissa McFarquhar, who's a New Yorker staff writer, book called Strangers Drowning, where she does these really deep and interesting profiles of individual kind of extreme altruists, and including, covering some folks within the effective altruist community and trying to unpack just like, what is the underlying psychology of people that are driven to devote their lives in a very intense way to different causes. And she profiles one person in the effective altruist community in particular, Julia Weiss, who's a GiveWell board member and has, for years now donated a vast majority of her disposable income to charities. And it's just a fascinating, very personal look at effective altruism. And then I would recommend the 80,000 Hours podcast that Rob Wiblin hosts for a really in-depth look at what are the different ways that and career options for how one can do the most good possible. So I think those are a couple places that I'd say people should start.
All right. Well, our guest today has been Buddy Shah, the managing director at GiveWell. Buddy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Jeremiah. It was a pleasure.